On the Mind. I'm Austin.
I am Duncan.
And I am Bryce.
All right, today we're going to be talking about the referendum vote in Turkey that basically gave Erdogan unilateral control over the government if he wants it. So, Duncan, a little background.
Okay, so in order to really understand the context of this, we have to go back to last year's coup, which we
actually do have a video on, if I remember correctly.
Correct, and we will link to that video in the description so you can learn everything about that.
Yeah.
So after that, Erdogan was obviously a little shaken in whether or not he had total control over Turkey. And it wasn't that much longer before this proposal came forward. Now, what this actually allowed him to do, this set of constitutional amendments that has recently been voted on, was to effectively take executive control over the entire country. So probably the most important thing that actually would change under the new amendments is the fact that the current system, which has both a president and a prime minister, would not continue to exist. The prime minister, who is the primary check on Erdogan's power, would cease to be in office.
Okay. Just for people who are unaware, what does the president control? What does the prime minister control?
Up until now, Erdogan has had largely unilateral powers in terms of foreign policy, very broad powers in terms of domestic policy, but most of that actually comes from the fact that his party controls the Turkish parliament. So working together with the prime minister has yielded a lot of informal power for Erdogan. As it stands, the prime minister is supposed to control most of the legislative action in Turkey.
All right. So the implications here are kind of broad. It's just basically him saying, I want complete power. And just to clarify a little more, the U.S. is harboring the man that he believes was responsible for that coup attempt.
Fethullah Gulen, yes.
All right. So that's where the implications are for U.S. policy is we might have had a little hand in not giving him exactly what he wanted, and that's how he felt he had to respond.
And the other thing that's interesting to note with this is that this really renews his possibility of holding power for a very long period of time. As it stands right now, the timeline is a little uncertain, but what it's looking like is that new elections will be called in 2019, probably November, but it's hard to tell. And past that point, under the new constitutional amendments, any president can hold power for up to 2 terms of 5 years each, which would be 10 years past 2019. Obviously, Erdogan will remain in office until the next set of elections. So presumably based on this, assuming he does not lose one of those elections, which with his party in power, it's unlikely, he could very well be the president of Turkey with extremely broad powers until 2029.
Okay. So, just to be clear, this referendum was a vote on Kemalism?
Well, in a sense, it was.
If I can explain it if you want to rest your...
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Duncan's a little sick this episode, so we're going to try to give him a little break, so that's probably going to make this episode much shorter. That's a joke. Or is
I got it. I laughed.
Thank you, Bryce, for always... Anyway, so Kemalism... according to Duncan, he wrote this in our group chat earlier, and I thought it was brilliant, so I'm going to read it. Kemalism is basically the guiding set of ideas put forward by Ataturk?
Correct. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who was the first president of Turkey in the post-Ottoman era.
Okay, after the Ottoman Empire.
Came to power in 1923, I believe.
Right after World War I, which makes sense.
Correct.
So there are 2 major points which you outlined. It says the key points are that the power should be distributed through a parliamentary system and kind of like the checks and balances that our country had.
Right.
And the government should be secular, which are the 2 points that got challenged in this referendum.
Correct. Now, Erdogan is at least ostensibly a secular ruler. He does not have any noted religious authority. However, for the past several years, he has been drifting slowly further back toward more of an Islamist ideology. And of course, compared to many of the other nations in the region, this is very moderate, but it is still disturbing for Turkey.
Seriously disturbing, especially when you see that some of our allies, such as Israel, have leaders that are doing something quite the same. And Netanyahu, who started off moderate enough,
right,
but is now far-right crazy.
Right, and secularism has worked very well for Turkey up until this point. I mean, we have to remember that this is why in a Muslim-majority country that has a republican form of government, we actually have a solid ally in Turkey.
That's right. We were going to talk about the implications with the NATO. Good Lord. Yes, so Bryce, about NATO. Go ahead.
Oh wait, no, I don't want to talk about NATO. I was want to
You
talk
raised
about.
your hand.
I know, but I was
Just
thinking we were still
wanted
talking about other stuff. I wanted to go
Audience to
back.
know that you're raising
Just
your
talk about
hand.
NATO, and then come back to me
No, go
to
ahead.
talk
go
about
ahead.
the.
You raised your hand. I have to call on
All
you.
right.
Besides, you haven't said anything yet.
I haven't. I've been waiting patiently. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the secularism, or rather the lack of secularism, which will be coming to Turkey. The Turkish school Department of Education has announced a new curriculum for their schools, which includes much more religious text. And also, it declares Aragon as the hero.
Erdogan.
I know.
Erdogan.
I
It's
like-
actually, in Turkish,
saying
it's pronounced Recep Tayyip Erdogan.
Oh, you're making that another one of those book jokes, aren't you?
Yeah, I like calling him Aragon. So it depicts. They're going to be depicting Aragon as a hero amongst the coup that
Nothing like a
that
cult
we
of
were talking about
personality.
a long time ago.
To really tip off your dictatorship.
Now, that's actually one thing that is sort of still in line with the underlying ideology of Kemalism, which is that it was a very nationalist ideology, as were most post-World War I ideologies, as we've seen
Not
historically.
unnatural, yeah.
So, the amount of nationalism that is still present in not only Erdogan's party, but Erdogan personally, is still very much in line with Kemalism in some ways, but it's on some of the other elements that he's mostly challenging it.
And then with the idea that democracy is somewhat dying in Turkey, whereas this dictatorship is coming into further and further into fruition. This idea of nationalism, depicting him as a hero when he has razor thin approval ratings, whereas that might even be rigged, as some say. It's just sort of frightening that this is happening there. What are you laughing at?
I'm sorry, when you said rigged, the first thing that popped in my head was our glorious leader.
Yeah, from what I've read about Aragon, it doesn't seem as though he has very many differences to Trump. Just from what I read.
They're both orange.
If I another thing I read, especially in terms of like the sort of religious aspect to him, that's I don't want to keep saying coming into fruition, but I can't think of a better term for it.
Rising up.
He has a new palace, which costs $600 million and has 1,100 rooms, and people are comparing this to the sort of Islamic center of the world, which used to be the Ottoman Empire.
So I just have to ask, does he have a membership at the Mar-a-Lago? 'Cause that's the only thing that Trump really cares about. Anyway, speaking of things that Trump doesn't care about, let's talk about NATO. So, this is going to have major implications because Turkey is currently in NATO. Well, is it looking for membership?
No, Turkey is a full member of NATO. You're thinking of the European Union that
That's
it was
right,
for
European
a time trying to gain membership into. Right now, economically, I don't think it wants it.
So yeah, it's in there. However, seeing the way they're moving, I have doubts that they're going to be allowed to stay in NATO, or if they're even going to want to.
Well, now this becomes a very complicated situation because in order to really understand the NATO context, we have to look at the context of the Syrian civil war. For those of you who aren't aware, Turkey does directly border Syria for a substantial distance. Now, as the NATO treaty is written, the reigning government of Turkey, that being Erdogan's government, is actually allied directly to the United States. Under Article 7 of that treaty, any attack on one, specifically Turkey, is an attack on all. And there really isn't a precedent for removing a country from the treaty organization. Now, with that said, up until this point, even, as it's gone so far, Turkey has been a remarkably poor ally for the last 5 years or so.
Right.
A big part of their foreign agenda with regards to the Syrian civil war is the prevention of the creation of an independent Kurdistan in either Iraq, Iran, or Syria, or some mixture of all three. Now, That actually has worked very much in opposition to our interests because the Kurds are one of the most reliable groups over there that we can actually count on to directly combat Islamic State, and the territory in Syrian and Iraqi Kurdistan also lies directly between the major power centers of Daesh, those being al-Raqqa and Mosul.
I also want to just bring up, Turkey isn't exactly hostile with Russia.
They have strained relations.
Strained, but they're not as strained as with most other NATO countries.
Actually, that's not quite true. Recently, and again, this is in the context of the Syrian civil war, a Russian fighter plane strayed over
We talked
Turkish.
about that too, actually.
We did.
So,
Link in the description below.
we can remember the video.
Right. A Russian fighter plane flew over the Syrian border into Turkey and was shot down, leading to severely strained relations. Now, the Turks and the Russians have a long history together, and most of it fairly animous. So it's
I want to go back. This is going back quite a ways, actually. During the Russian invasion of the Crimean,
yeah.
didn't wasn't it purchasing oil from that, or what am I thinking? Daesh.
You are actually thinking around that same time, Erdogan's government and even Erdogan's family were accused of actually allowing Daesh to run oil into Turkey.
That's right.
For profit. They were identified as potential major financiers of Daesh.
And that goes counter to the Allies and NATO's interests.
But getting back to Kurdistan, I just want to wrap that up real quick.
Go for it.
Every time that something has gone south in Syria, Turkey has reacted not by attacking any group necessarily within Syria until very recently. They have actually started working against Daesh, interestingly, even in conjunction with the Kurds. But for a very long period of time, what they were doing is using the Syrian civil war as an excuse to bomb Syrian Kurdistan. Now, they have a long history with a group called the PKK, which is a semi-Marxist Kurdish group. Obviously not the nicest people in the world, shall we say. But most of their issues were back in the late 80s to early 90s. This is kind of ancient history. Erdogan, like a lot of world leaders, is sort of fighting the last war. It's understandable, but not necessarily pragmatic from a foreign policy standpoint. And again, up until now, Erdogan's greatest area of authority has been foreign policy.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of interesting now that he's regaining power that he's starting to work with the Kurds.
Yeah, well, the Kurds have carved themselves out a very interesting niche in this war because they are the only group that is simultaneously on at least good terms with Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the United States.
That is pretty insane.
You know, they hold the best strategic position in the entire war. They control an incredibly mountainous region in the Zagros Mountains that is directly between Mosul and Raqqa. They have the ability to cut off Daesh, and they are no friends of the Islamic State in any way, shape, or form. So they are the best ally to have in this particular fight, and they've proved themselves incredibly effective. The Peshmerga did manage to lose a couple of battles right at first because it hadn't engaged in the field in a long time. But after that, they moved back in, got into combat again, and they have been devastatingly effective at limiting the power of the Islamic State in both Syria and Iraq.
And it's interesting to me that you use the word limiting there, because that was kind of the strategy with the Obama administration, was strategic limiting. Keeping
Correct.
them saying, here's the line, they're not crossing it.
Correct. And the Kurds were instrumental in any sort of strategy that involved them not crossing the Zagros Mountains.
Absolutely, and I think that's where a lot of people kind of get it mixed up, is Obama's was kind of more protecting allies. I think that was his goal, instead of containing ISIS as much as he wanted to prevent slaughter. But in his handling with Syria, at least, I think he failed in that.
Yeah, and let's not forget that for a long time, Barack Obama actively considered Bashar al-Assad the primary target of American interests in Syria, in the Syrian civil war. It is very fair to say that Barack Obama underestimated the danger posed by a geographical caliphate formed by an Islamic extremist group in Syria. Mm-hmm. So he did have some strategical issues there, but, the Kurds, even at that point, because it's their territory that lay immediately in between those two regions, were at least very instrumental in making sure that Daesh did not spread into the territory they controlled. They were also very useful when the Yazidi were targeted by Daesh. They're a religious minority group that lives on very few mountains in that region. And the Peshmerga was actually able to stop a major genocide of them, or at least severely limited, I should say.
You're talking the Kurds up to be just incredible heroes.
We shouldn't quite go that far, but strategically in this war, they are extremely useful, and they have a reason to fight not only for their territory, but most of the Kurdish groups actually do want Kurdish independence at some point in the future, something that Turkey has always let it be known that if that occurs, they will actively invade a new Kurdish state.
Okay, so I'm just going to assume that's the inter-Islam disagreements.
It's not even so much that, it's more the PKK issues, and the fact that Kurdistan, even though it is a significant region, is spread between several countries, and most of it is in Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. They have significant territory in Turkey, so Turkey actually considers that a political and military threat if an independent Kurdistan were ever to arise.
Fair enough. Okay, so let's wrap up NATO real quick. And I can understand why it's such a tricky situation with NATO now. It's, on the one hand, they've been horrible allies, but on the other, they probably don't want to leave.
No, I cannot see them actively leaving because, especially during that incident with the fighter plane that came into their territory, they did definitely play the "we're a member of NATO" card in dealing with Russia and that. So strategically, it's better for them to remain in NATO.
Right, because it's almost widely known that NATO's anti-Russia.
That's the entire point of it.
So seeing them, they're looking at it and saying, we have a problem with Russia, why would we want to leave NATO? And the other NATO countries are saying, you're horrible allies, why would we want to protect you? But they don't really have a clear way of kicking them out.
Correct. And the problem is, if you start doing the whole "you're a horrible ally" thing, Article 7 of the NATO treaty becomes completely unenforceable. 1 minute you're not rushing to the defense of Turkey when something goes on there. The next minute, probably not Putin, but some future Russian leader is invading the Baltic republics.
I'm going to call it now. If Putin's going to be the golden age of Russian, subterfuge. I think that after he's gone, because let's face it, he's the only one that's been actively in charge of doing this stuff.
Correct.
After he's gone, they're going to have a hard time replacing him.
Well, that's true. Russia does have a long tradition of sort of military strongmen as leaders. And there are people around Putin, Sergei Lavrov, their Minister of State, being a very major example. Putin, while very good at what he does, is sort of archetypal of very strong Russian leaders. I don't think he's the last example we're going to see of his tactics.
I think in the current Russian government, he's the most proficient.
Without question, that's not even up for debate.
Not even up for debate. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up. Any final words, Bryce? Your second time speaking?
Okay, is this final statements?
Yep, we're going to do closing statements.
Oh, okay. I find it very terrifying, the growing number of leaders who use religion to take power. And I think that while freedom of religion should be something that, in my opinion, all countries should have, that does mean that it should stay out of government as well.
I'll go next, I suppose. I'm going to look Duncan right in the eyes as I say this. Karl Marx was right. Forming a cult of personality is always a bad idea. Sorry, I had to watch that reaction. I don't think that any leader that has to use a cult of personality is ever going to be truly a representative of their people, personally. I always think it'll backfire once people realize that it's not working the way it should, especially in fascist-style countries. We see it in Venezuela right now, actually. The protests still going on, side note?
Yes, they actually are, and they have been escalating, especially in terms of police and military use of tear gas in Caracas.
Fantastic. They can afford tear gas, but not food. Anyway, I just hope that Turkey at least tries to remain moderate, though if we're using religion as the basis of power, I have a hard time seeing that. I'm also interested in seeing the NATO allies kind of leveraging their backing of Turkey as a way to keep that from happening.
So I guess I'll phrase my final statement in the context of just the general move toward less limited governments worldwide. The West, the East, all over the world we're seeing this. And Turkey is a shining example of what happens when you take what was ultimately a hereditary monarchy, the Ottoman Empire, and turn it into a limited republican form of government. And under Ataturk and his successors, it's been extremely successful. It's become incredibly prosperous. It's become a major power in its region. And I really just see this as one more sort of nail in the coffin of limited government worldwide. We're seeing it in the United States. We're seeing it in Britain. We're seeing it in Asia right now. And we are seeing it in Turkey. And I think that the more that this continues to go on, the harder it's going to be to revert to more limited forms of government when people realize that they are the superior ways to run countries. So I see this as part of a perhaps unsurprising but incredibly disturbing phenomenon.
Fantastic. That's something I go to sleep to. All right. So that's all that's on the mind this week. I'm Austin.
I am Duncan.
I am Bryce.
He is. Thank you for joining. If you like this video, please remember to like, subscribe, and most importantly, comment. We want to know what you're thinking about this topic. Let us know if you want to hear about anything in the future as well. Go ahead.
Also, if we happen to have any listeners who are actually in Turkey, please give us your opinions. Tell us what you thought about the referendum. On YouTube, we have a worldwide audience, so it is pretty awesome to get to hear from people who are actually in the countries we're talking about. So any Turks out there, please tell us what you thought.
All right. Thanks, and have a great night.